has been to be part of this amazing meeting, and how much thank you for all of you for your warmth, and for the people who've opened their hearts to me in private. And just to say, I'm not rushing off at the end. I'll hang around, and if there are people who particularly would like to chat personally, it'd be a privilege for me. And so we're approaching the last talk, and appropriate enough, we're talking about approaching the finishing line, about the actual process of dying. And I'm aware when I talk about this that many of us sitting here listening have already been touched by these issues. Many of us have watched our loved one die. And as I talk about this, I understand it can be triggering memories. They may be wonderful memories. They may be extremely painful memories. You may have watched people who haven't died well. And so I think, again, we just need to remember that these are issues not just out there. These are issues that touch all of us. And of course, as we face our own mortality, the question is, how am I going to die? Who will be there? What will happen? And what I think is so important is that we need to talk about these things. You know, dying has become one of those terrible taboo subjects. And it's so within the Christian community. It's been sanitized, it's been pushed away, it's been medicalized. And yet we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it before the crisis strikes. So, my text for this talk is from Thessalonians. Brothers, we don't want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. So here again is the image of the marathon race, the course that's been set out for us, that we don't choose the race, that we have to be with perseverance, it's that we fix our eyes on Jesus, that it's for the joy that was set before him. But now we've talked about these three transitions, the transition from retirement, from paid employment, the move into dependence, and now the actual process of dying itself. And each of these, as we've stressed, involves some kind of loss, but also a most wonderful opportunity. And it's exactly the same about the finishing line. There is the most amazing opportunity ahead of us. And it's interesting, this is, again, the finishing line of a marathon. It's interesting to see the attitudes of different people facing, you know, some of them absolutely celebrating, some of them just hanging on, desperately struggling with their eyes fixed on that line. There are some amazing photographs on you can find on the internet. This is Hayley Carruthers, an elite runner in the London Marathon, who just fell to the floor, just feet away, and who literally crawled across the mat. And here's another guy who has actually nearly collapsed, and someone rushes out from the crowd and helps him across. I have to say, medically, when I look at this guy, I think, gosh, something terrible is happening there. And the most important thing is to get him on the ground and in the recovery position. The worst thing to do is to help him out. But nonetheless, it's a kind of it's a vivid description, isn't it, of the, you know, he's run 26 miles, and now we're at the finishing line, and so this is what we're facing. And wonderful words from John Dunlop, a Christian physician who's cared for many dying people, and he says, "One thing I have learned is that dying well is rarely a coincidence. Rather, it results from choices made throughout life. After all, dying well is nothing more than living well right up to the end." Those are wise words. Dying well is nothing more than living well right up to the end. But it isn't a coincidence. It happens because we've thought about it. The marathon runner has been thinking about that finishing line, thinking about how they're going to be, because I think what runners say is actually the finishing line can be a dangerous time when you've conserved your energy, you've been over 26 miles, but actually it can all go horribly wrong in those last few meters, and therefore you need to plan ahead as to how you're going to finish, not to go completely mad. And there's a very interesting attitudes that Christians and the Christian faith has towards death. It has this kind of strange ambiguity. On the one hand, it's absolutely clear through that whole of the scriptures that death is the enemy. It's the final enemy. And therefore, we never welcome death. We never hasten death. And of course, that's the fundamental reason why assisted suicide and euthanasia is wrong, because it is to turn death into a blessing, into a good. And it isn't. It's an enemy. And yet, at the same time, by God's grace, that enemy can be redeemed, can be transformed, and can become a severe mercy, even a strange kind of healing. There are some situations which are so affected by the consequences of the fall, by disease, by decay, by brokenness, that death itself can become a strange kind of healing. But also the process of dying can be a kind of adventure, a gateway into a new reality. And so I want to focus on just some of the opportunities that dying well can bring. And most of this has come out from my own experience of having had the privilege of accompanying many dying people along the way over the years. And one of those is spiritual growth, that we talked before about how from the outside, as somebody approaches the end, their body can increasingly appear to be a complete wreck. And things are failing, and they're shriveling, and so on. But internally, it can be completely different. And the person is growing and developing and intensely alive inside. And that's a wonderful miracle that I've seen previously. We talked about Gabby. Do you remember we call her the angel Gabriel because she shines. And that's a wonderful miracle that you can sometimes see as people come to the end. So there's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for each of us as we approach the finishing line for more growth, for more internal, like that tree rooted, flourishing internally. But it's also an opportunity for healing, building, celebrating, and in a sense, completing relationships. This is one of the fascinating things about people who are dying, and that is they have a kind of relational authority. When you are dying, you can say things and do things in your relationships that you can never do in the rest of your life. So the person who is dying and has had this broken, terrible relationship with his son, and for 20 years, the last time they spoke, there was this terrible argument, and the son stormed out, and they haven't spoken for 20 years. It's as the older man is facing his death, he can actually say, you know what, before I die, I would love to speak to my son. And the son will come across from Australia because his father's dying. And it's possible, therefore, I've seen it happen, for broken relationships to be restored as simply because of this kind of authority, this opportunity that dying can have. But it doesn't have to be broken relationships. It also can be just ways of celebrating relationships. The things that you can say things on your deathbed that are very difficult to say at other times. And it's an opportunity for saying those things. In previous Christian traditions, there was a great tradition of the last words. And, there's all those sick jokes about last words, famous last words. I think I'm getting better. but actually, there's a deep truth about last words, because the last words that we can give to other people can be the most amazing gift. They can be a gift that will stay with those people for the rest of their lives. It's because of this kind of authority that the dying person can have. So building, celebrating, even completing relationships. It sounds a bit strange to talk about completing relationships, and that's, of course, there's a sense in which, in God's grace, as we go on beyond into the new heaven and the new earth, we will continue celebrating and building our relationships. But there is also a sense in which it's not good to die with unfinished business. If there is unfinished business in some of relationships, then dying is the opportunity to complete that, to get that out in the open, whatever it is. So there's an opportunity. Finding forgiveness. The dying process has always been seen as the most amazing opportunity for forgiveness, for grace. And of course, the most dramatic and wonderful example is the thief on the cross. And that's such a powerful image, that there are these two men, and they are both within feet of Christ. And they are both in an identical situation. But they have utterly opposite reactions. One of them hurls abuse and is angry and resentful and bitter. And the other one, close to death, says, "Lord, have mercy on me. And remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "I tell you this day, you will be with me in paradise." And one of the ancient commentators said, one thief was saved to give us hope that even on deathbed there was redemption. Just one, so that we shouldn't presume. So the deathbed conversion is a reality, and it can happen. And I came across a wonderful story. A friend of mine was telling me about the story about her mother. And this is what she said. So that an older woman, whom I shall call Mary, was diagnosed with a very advanced and aggressive form of cancer. And she'd experienced a life of broken relationships. And her daughter, that's my friend, described her as an intensely angry person with a sharp and destructive tongue. Her daughter had found faith in Christ as a young adult, but her mother, Mary, had always rejected and rebuffed any attempt to talk about God or the gospel. But then came the sudden news that Mary had advanced cancer and only weeks to live. And her daughter told me they were sitting in the radiotherapy outpatient department, surrounded by patients. You can just imagine, what it's like in a busy hospital department and all the noise and kerfuffle. And Mary turns to her daughter and says, "I've just got 3 questions. 1, how can I forgive? 2, how can I be forgiven? And 3, what is heaven like?" And her daughter said, sitting in the outpatient department, she tried to share her faith and with her mother. And for the first time, Mary talked about the hidden secret of being abused as a child, and the shame and the hurt and the hatred and the anger which had dominated her life. So that's why her first question was, how can I forgive? And Mary's daughter gently shared about the person of Christ and his forgiveness, that she could be wiped clean, that heaven was a place of safety where nothing could harm again. And from that time in the outpatient department, Mary's life changed. And her daughter said, "My mum was remade 2 weeks before she died. I've never seen anything more radical in my life." And Mary was admitted to a local nursing home for terminal care. In place of previous bitterness and resentment, there was thankfulness. Her daughter remembers Mary's gratitude on receiving a plate of pureed vegetables. "I can't believe how kind you are to me," she said. Sitting with her grandchildren, she was weeping. "You've got no idea what it feels like to pray for the first time. I feel as though there's an external power to control my tongue. I have the power to choose what I want to say." Mary died barely 2 weeks from the conversation in the outpatient department, with her daughter holding her hand and singing hymns to her. And at the end, as the end came, her daughter whispered to her, "Your body isn't needed anymore. You're going to receive a brand new body." And then very gently, the last breath. And immediately after Mary's death, the nurses gathered in her room. This was an amazing lady. She was so grateful for everything. She was so kind, so gentle. She had no fear about dying. We've never seen anyone die like this. And her daughter was able to share with them. She told me, with the body of her mother there in the room, she was able to share with the nurses about the Christian faith. So dying well is an opportunity to find forgiveness and to become a new creation. Reordering priorities. I think as we face the finishing line, then suddenly some things which seem incredibly important to us vanish. And here I just want to tell very briefly the story of Stuart. Stuart was a good friend of mine. He was a professional musician. He was doing a PhD in something of musicology and music in the Reformation period. He was quite a shy, sort of slightly nerdish kind of guy. He was a brilliant musician, but he was not very much a people kind of person. And then he was diagnosed with lymphoma, a nasty, aggressive kind of cancer, and he received chemotherapy. He improved for a period, and then suddenly it seemed the cancer was coming back. And I remember, I knew him quite well. We chatted together, and we were having a cup of coffee, and I sensed that he was much closer to death than he realized. The doctors were talking about trying some new experimental chemotherapy and so on. I said to him, "If I could give you 3 months of really good quality life, and then you were to die, what would you do with those 3 months?" And I thought he was going to say, "Oh, I really want to finish my PhD," or something like that. He said, and what he said to me really surprised me. He said, "You know what? If I knew I had only 3 months to live, what I would do is I would give up all the music. I would start having proper palliative care and pain relief, and then I would want to write a letter. And I would like to write a letter to everybody that I've ever known in my life and witness to them and tell them about what's happening to me and share something about Christ." And this was not the Stuart I thought I knew. But that's exactly what happened. I mean, this was some years ago, so he had an address book. So he got out his address book, and he started writing letters, and he started a day in his address book. And every day, he was writing letters, and he was trying to get 10 or 15 through a day. And then as the days were going by and he was running out of time, in the end he sort of photostated. That shows how old he is. Do you remember photostats? He photostated a letter and then sort of had explaining what was happening to him and then wrote on the end of it and so on. And he did die about 3 months later. And at the memorial service at All Souls Church, there were over 400 people there, and many of whom were there just because they'd received a letter. And it was one of those incredibly intense and moving services. But I remember at the time, this was many years ago, thinking, I'm quite envious of Stuart because he was able to say the sort of things that most of us can't say and to write the kind of things that most of us can't write. And it was all because he was dying well. So reordering priorities, an opportunity to work out what's really important to us. Fulfilling dreams. Again, it's amazing when people are dying. It gives you a kind of opportunity to say, you know what? I would just love to go and see the whales in Alaska. I would just love the opportunity to whatever it is. And again, you can get away with it when you're dying. It's something that fulfilling dreams is an opportunity, something that God has placed in your hearts that dying well can bring. Letting go, we've already talked about this, haven't we? That letting go, instead of having things ripped out of our hands against our will, voluntarily and gradually choosing to let go. It's an ancient image that often our hand is like this, desperately grasping onto things. But a hand that is crucified can no longer grasp. And that's our calling as we approach the finishing line, like Jesus, to become like him in his death. And that includes letting go. Being thankful. Again, one of those amazing paradoxes that some of the most thankful people are the people who are dying. Wonderful words here from a younger lady who was dying. She was called Ruth van den Broek. She had cystic fibrosis and was becoming terminally unwell. And she wrote this: when it comes to dying well, gratitude has been one of the most transformative things for me. Gratitude for my body, despite its brokenness, for my medical team, despite their limits, for the decay of my lungs, because it makes me notice and appreciate most of my waking breaths. A while back, I started praying before I took medications, the way I do before food. Lord, thank you for these medications. Thank you for the people who invented, prescribed, and prepared them. Please bless them to my body, and my body in your service. I began to see them as the blessings they are. Gratitude has changed so much for me, even though I'm still not great at it. So, isn't that remarkable that as we face at the finishing line, actually by God's grace, we can experience more of gratitude. And it's often gratitude for the little things. It's for the just, that bowl of pureed vegetables, or watching through the window a bird fly, or seeing the signs of spring. Being thankful. Leaving a legacy for the next generation. Here again is the authority that the dying person can have. And particularly, writing letters. If you're a parent or a grandparent, here's the opportunity to write a letter for your children, for your loved ones, for your grandchildren, for the people who are most closest to you, for your spiritual children, to encourage them, to remind them, to point to the faithfulness of God in your life. And again, I think it gives you an opportunity to say those kind of things that we find difficult to say normally. How much someone means to us, how much their example has meant to us. Focusing on the finishing line, and I think I said in the first talk, my friend Philippa Taylor, who's an elite marathon runner, she was describing how she copes when she hits the wall. And one of the things she does is the two things she do. One is to focus on this present moment, just to focus on every step, every breath, every moment, just instead of worrying what lies ahead. And then focusing on the finishing line, imagining passing that finishing line. And I had a very good friend, Alan Toogood, who was dying. I knew him very well from All Souls. We'd had many, many heart-sharing sessions. We both of us experienced great loss. And he was a marathon runner. And he was a very experienced man from Neonatal. And I heard Philippa talking about this just previously, just a week or two previously, and it just rang in my mind, this is a message for Alan. And so I shared it with him. And he said, yes, that's absolutely right. And that's what I need to do. I need to focus on the finishing line. And his friends had given him this little cross, a hand cross, a holding cross. And this had become very significant for him. He took hold of the cross with a resolute grasp, and it remained with him throughout his whole time in hospital. And I went to see him, by God's grace. I happened to just see him just hours before he died. And he whispered to me, I don't normally go in for this kind of thing, he said. But I want to die with this cross in my hand. Mind you, John, it's an empty cross. It's a reminder of the resurrection. Yes, Alan, yes. And only a few hours later, he crossed the finishing line, holding on, like the marathon runner he was, to meet his risen Lord. So, dying well is an opportunity. It really is. And we need to see and pray that God would give us those opportunities, and also that we would encourage those who we know well. But of course, that's not to sanitize or to fact that dying can also be a time of great testing, a time of trial. And I haven't got time really to go into some of the tests and temptations that dying, but I cover it more in the book Dying Well, if you want to go into that in greater detail, that's where I talk about that. But I think what's important to think about is, if you are approaching the end, what are some of the issues that you need to think about? And here are some of the questions which you should be thinking about, talking to the medical professionals about. And what symptoms am I likely to suffer? And how can these be reduced? So there are a whole question of issues of symptoms as death approaches. And discussing this in advance, discussing what things that concern you, what you're worried about, how can they be reduced, is in advance is really helpful. And particularly problematic is the question, at what point do you say, I'm going to stop receiving treatment that was intended to keep me alive or to try and prolong my life? Should I carry on receiving medical treatment for my condition in the hope that it might prolong my life, or would it be better to stop all active medical treatments? And that's a really important but difficult question which we often have to face. And I use this diagram very often when teaching medical students and junior doctors, but it's a really important concept, and that is that every medical treatment we have can bring benefits. That's what's intended for, to bring benefits. But every medical treatment has burdens and it has risks. And the whole art is to balance the burdens and risks, to try and work out, is the medical treatment bringing more benefit, or is it balanced the other way? And particularly at the end of life, it can be quite difficult to know, and that's exactly why we need to discuss that and understand this kind of balancing process. Because any treatment where the burdens are greater than the benefits, then you need to stop that treatment. In fact, to carry on giving treatment that is bringing no benefits or burdens, where its burdens exceed the benefits, is actually a kind of abuse. It's wrong, and yet, sadly, time and time again it happens. It happens in NHS hospitals, and it happens because we haven't had this kind of discussion. What is this treatment for? Is it really doing any good? And in order to do that, we need to have these honest discussions. Where would I like to die? Would I like to die at home? Would I like to die in a specialist hospice? Would I like to die in an NHS hospital? Most people in the UK die in an NHS hospital. In fact, less than 10% of people die in a hospice, although frankly a hospice is a much better place if it's at all possible. And increasingly it is possible to die well at home, but you do need to plan it in advance. You need to have the right kind of support services, and so thinking in advance where I would like to die and who would I like to be there when I'm dying becomes incredibly important and something to be talked about in advance. Should there be a do not attempt resuscitation order? I haven't time to go into that, but that's often quite a complex and challenging issue. I discuss it more in my book, Dying Well. Who will support me physically, psychologically, and of course, incredibly important, spiritually? Who's going to support me spiritually at the end? I do want to pay tribute to Keith and his team and their work on advanced care planning. So the NHS and its management at the end of life is actually regarded as one of the gold standards across the world. That we are way in advance of most advanced countries in thinking about and planning for how people should die. And so advanced care planning is very much in the heart of the NHS. In theory, this is what we should all be doing. In theory, we should all be planning in advance for how we would like to die. And the books and booklets that Keith's group have produced are excellent, and I meant to wave one around on the advanced care planning. It's this booklet here which describes in very comprehensible language what the options are, what the law says, and so on. So there are a number of possibilities that advanced care planning lays down. One is what is called an advanced statement of preferences, where you write in advance for your medical and caring team what you want, how you would want to be looked after as you approach death. And I think this is an extremely helpful thing, because you don't know as the crisis strikes whether you will be able to speak, whether you will be confused, whether you will be unconscious, and so on. And if it's written down and signed what you would want and how you would like to be treated and who you would like to be there, that's extremely helpful for the medical and nursing team. It's not legally binding, but nonetheless, I think it's something that is extremely helpful. And particularly as a Christian, we can talk about what matters to us spiritually, what we would like, and so on. Who would we like to spiritually support us, and so on. And I had the privilege of being a sort of informal physician for John Stott as he was approaching his age and his end. And he asked me to help him in writing an advanced statement for him because he was concerned as a single man, what was going to happen for him as he came to the end. And so I helped him in drafting an advanced statement. And it's actually, it's in my book, Dying Well, if you're interested, and you can also find it on my website. But it's just an example, a kind of framework. It gives us a way of communicating the things that really matter to us for the medical professionals. Then there's the lasting power of attorney for health and welfare. Keith talked about this previously, and I think this is an excellent and important legal provision. And in principle, I think everybody should have a lasting power of attorney. But just as Keith says, you need to think really carefully about who you give this power to, because your attorney does have very strong legal powers. And also they carry a responsibility. It's possible that they will carry a life and death responsibility. It's possible that the person you say you nominate as attorney is going to legally take responsibility for whether the life support treatment is switched off or not. And that is a pretty heavy, major responsibility which you may have to carry for the rest of your life. So you need to think carefully and talk together about who you want to give that power to. But nonetheless, it's a very powerful protection which allows the person you nominate to play a very important role in decisions at the end of life, including the medical decisions. And then there is this third thing, the advance decision to refuse treatment, where you write in advance what you don't want to have. Legally, you can't demand treatment. You can't say, I insist that I receive X, Y, Z. But you can say, and that's the reason for that, is that doctors say we must only give you treatment if we genuinely believe it's for your good. And if we genuinely believe this treatment is completely inappropriate and wrong and hopeless and damaging for you, then even though you're saying, I insist it, we don't have a legal duty to give it you. But you do have the legal right to refuse treatment. Again, we can talk about that in greater detail if you're interested. And so I do discuss this in more detail in my book, Dying Well, if you forgive the self-publicity. A lot of this material is also on my website, available for free if you're interested. So suppose now, instead of being the person themselves who is facing death, suppose this is your loved one. And the problem, as we know, is that so many times when with our loved ones, we feel they are not really being realistic about the future. It's sometimes very difficult to have this kind of conversation. And so how would you do it? And so I've got 3 questions which I would suggest. Now, the first one is to get them to talk about what do they think is going on. What is your understanding about what's going on? And sometimes it's a surprise. You may know that this person is dying, but when you say, and what do you think is going on? Oh, I think it's just nothing too serious. I'm hoping that I'm going to be turning the corner soon. So actually just getting them to talk about it gives you an opportunity to know how then to engage with them and gently to challenge them. So start off by getting them to talk about their understanding. And then I think there are 2 fundamental groups of questions. The first question is, as you look to the future, what are you most worried about? What are your fears? What are your concerns? What are your worries? And it's very interesting to see, actually, if you can only get people to talk about their worries, often those worries and concerns are really quite unrealistic or out of proportion. But it's not until we express that, until we allow people to talk about what really frightens them as they're looking towards the end, that we can really understand and help them. For some people, the greatest fears are of medical overtreatment. What they're worried about is that people are going to put me in the intensive care unit and that they're going to fill me full of drugs and I'm going to end up with tubes coming out of every orifice. And I don't want to do that. I don't want that. That's not what I want. But for some other people, it's precisely the opposite. My fear is that I'm just going to be abandoned and that people are going to starve me and dehydrate me and nobody's going to be there to care for me. And I'm going to be abandoned and neglected. So it's by getting people to talk about their fears. What is it for you? What is it that you're most frightened about and worried about? Once we get those terrible fears out into the open, we start to see actually they're not really things to worry about. We can tackle this once we know what they are. We can make sure that doesn't happen. But we need to know what it is you're worried about. And I think a very important concept is the idea of total pain. It was Cicely Saunders, a wonderful Christian pioneer, innovator, who developed a whole new way of caring for dying people, invented by a Christian, and it went round the world. And just a little aside, I had, one of the interesting things is that euthanasia has been legalized in many other countries now, and yet the UK has been a stalwart in refusing to legalize it. And I happened some years ago to sit next to a very distinguished medical Lord, member of the House of Lords, who'd actually chaired a committee as to whether or not euthanasia should be legalized some years ago in the UK. And I thought this was too good an opportunity to miss. And so I asked him the question. He wasn't a Christian, he wasn't a believer, and actually the reputation was he was quite in favor of euthanasia in principle. So I said to him, why did he think euthanasia had not been legalized in the UK? And he said, oh, that's very simple, just two words, Cicely Saunders. And that, you heard that from the horse's mouth. And that was because she, as a Christian person, had developed a completely different, positive way of caring for dying people. And again, it just shows you the potential influence that Christian people can have in our society if they are living out the gospel for Christ. And one of her great insights was this concept of total pain. She said that someone facing the end of life, yes, they may have physical pain because there's the actual disease process pressing on, cancer pressing on nerves or something like that. But there's psychological pain. There's things going on with fear, with depression, with anxiety, with intrusive thoughts, worries, and so on. Then there's often relational pain. It's, worrying about the broken relationships, worrying about what the impact of my illness is having on my relatives, on my family, worrying about the future, what's going to happen to my disabled daughter when I die, those kind of relational issues. And then there's spiritual or existential pain to do with guilt, or about the meaninglessness of existence. And what Cicely Saunders says is we need to address all four levels of pain simultaneously. We need to investigate and understand. So for physical pain, yes, there are powerful painkillers. We need, and potential. There are, all sorts of specialist treatments that are available for physical pain. In fact, physical pain is not the problem. Thank God for that, because of advances in medical care. Physical pain is rarely the real problem. The real problem pains are the other ones. It's the psychological pain, the relational pain, and the spiritual pain. And of course, for psychological pain, it's talking, it's friendship. Sometimes it's talking therapists, CBT, or professional psychotherapy or something. For relational pain, it's actually getting out and talking with the relatives, and discussing, bringing openly, solving these broken relationships. And for spiritual pain, it's raising the issues. And Cicely Saunders built her custom-built hospice, and she put the chapel in the center of the hospice. And there was a daily cycle of worship going on in the chapel. And she designed it so that however sick people were and however close to death, they could be pushed in their beds into the chapel and receive the sacraments, the Holy Communion, and take part in the worship service, because spiritual care was at the heart of what she said was important. And I've used this quote before: suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. That quote comes out of the palliative care movement, because what Cicely Saunders knew was the most important thing was just being there. The greatest fear that most people have as they come to the end is they fear abandonment. They fear being left alone. And what we need to do is come alongside and promise, I am going to walk with you to the end. I will not leave you. We will be there for you to the end. And then, as you look to the future, what are your goals for this stage of your life? What are the trade-offs you're willing to make and those you're not willing to make? What would you long to happen before you die? Cicely Saunders says, our goal is to help you to die well. But not only that, our goal is to help you to live before you die. And that slogan, to live before you die, became one of the slogans of the palliative care movement. And she recognized this, that actually those last few hours and days could be very intense, could be very meaningful, very precious. And so what comes out so clearly is that God's plan for this age is not to abolish suffering. Yes, he is going to abolish suffering. Yes, he is going to wipe away every tear, but it's not for this age. God's plan for this age is to redeem suffering, to bring blessing and healing out of agony and loss and evil. And then just finally, falling asleep. And that's why I use that text from Thessalonians. It's very, very interesting that the New Testament Christians didn't talk about dying. They talked about falling asleep. And it was very clear that it was a very conscious thing. It comes in the New Testament. The phrase is used repeatedly. One of the most dramatic things is it's even used of Stephen as he's being martyred. If you go back and read in Acts, as the boulders are coming in this horrific death, it says, and then he fell asleep. So it's remarkable. So in fact, in that verse from Thessalonians, what it says is that Jesus died, but we fall asleep. In other words, Jesus took the full horror of death, the full reality of death, so that we don't need to. He extracted it out of us. He extracted the awfulness of death. So what do? We fall asleep. And so that's what it says. Brothers, we don't want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and he's going to bring those who've fallen asleep. Christ experiences the full awfulness of death. So the sting and the power and the grip of death has been fatally weakened, and life has triumphed, so we can fall asleep. So what is the difference between dying and falling asleep? Well, from a medical point of view, sleep is a very interesting and strange phenomenon, because sleep is a form of profound unconsciousness, but it's not a coma. So what do we know about the person who is asleep? Is inaccessible. You can't have a good conversation with somebody who's fast asleep. But we all know that when our loved one is asleep, the person is still there. They're intact. They're safe. They're unharmed. And we also know you only have to touch them and suddenly, bing, they're awake. And the person is there. And that's the point. The person is in no way damaged or harmed or lost by the sleep. They're still there, but they're inaccessible. They've fallen asleep. And so when our loved ones fall asleep in Christ, they are still, in a sense, alive. They are safe. They are unharmed, but they're inaccessible. And they're going to wake up again. And there are these wonderful scriptures, particularly in the Old Testament, that talk about waking up. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied. Yes, that's something we experience every day, but it's clear that it's ultimate fulfillment. When I awake, I'm going to see your face, and I shall be satisfied. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. So part of what it's all about is to teach us not to fear that we've lost our loved ones or that we ourselves are going to be lost. We're going to fall asleep, but we're still there. But secondly, what has struck me is that many people worry about what on earth is that process of dying is going to be like. Yes, I've got faith, I'm going to meet God, but actually, what is it going to be like to die? Am I going to be sucked into some horrible black hole? Is it going to be a sort of, if you've got a vivid imagination, you've watched a few horror films, it can be horrific kind of images can be there in your mind. And so do you know what? Our Heavenly Father allows us to practice what it's like to die faithfully, to die as a believer and a follower of Christ every single night of our lives. You know exactly what it's like to die in Christ, and it's like putting your head, you had this long, long day, you've been absolutely exhausted, and at long last, you've eventually hit your bed, and your head hits the pillow. In fact, it's even better than that, because this is the last night of a most terrible ordeal, and tomorrow morning the holiday starts. And all you've got to do is go to sleep and give way. And that's what it means to die well. That's what it's about. It's falling asleep. And I recommend to you that tonight, as your head touches the pillow, you practice what it's like. You commit your spirit into God's hands. And that's why, actually, in the Christian tradition, the nunc dimittis, which comes from Simeon's story, now, Lord, let now my depart, for my eyes have seen my glory, becomes the prayer that you sing every evening in Compline. Because you're practicing. It's safe. Simeon could say, it's safe for me to depart because my eyes have seen your glory. And so now, let me depart. And so every night we practice it. Because one day it's going to be for real. And then we're going to wake up. So falling asleep is not something strange, alien, or terrifying. It's an experience that our Heavenly Father gives us in advance so that we don't need to be fearful. And so, as we just think about what are old people for, many of these things can still be done even on our deathbeds. Even on our deathbeds, we can be doing these things. We can be praying, we can be grateful, we can be letting go, we can be exercising hope, we can be leaving a legacy. And I'll close with these, again, 3 words, 3 phrases. And it seems like this is a message for many of us here. As we look back on our lives, it's so easy, isn't it, to feel regret, to remember those feelings of failure, and that's a temptation from the evil one. And we mustn't give way to that. So remember these words of hope. The good cannot be lost. Nothing can take it away. Even if you've forgotten what it was, God hasn't forgotten. And it's going to be there in the bride, the wonderful garments of the bride. It says, as the bride appears in all her glory. Do you know what her glory is, what those garments is? It's the righteous deeds of the saints. Every single act of goodness is actually not lost. It's all there. Every act of faithfulness, every act of compassion, every act of grace, every single act is there in the garments of the bride. None of it is lost, even the ones we've forgotten about. It's all there. The good cannot be lost, the evil can be redeemed, and the best is yet to come. God bless you.